I have given speeches on similar topics for several years now. The bad news is that if you have seen any of those other ones at previous IACPs, the bad jokes are all the same. However, the good news is that a lot of the information has actually changed. We spent a lot of time over the last several years talking about quality of service, priority and preemption for public safety when it was largely theoretical. What we're very pleased to be able to do now is to talk about it as something that is factual and real and you can go out and get and use today. And I'll be talking specifically not just about how this works in general, but how it works specifically on FirstNet, which is, again, something that we've been working on for a great deal of time and are very pleased to now actually be able to show how it works in practice. I should also say I will try to keep this brief. I know that for many of you, I'm what's standing between you and checking your fantasy football scores. So, I actually did a previous presentation a couple years ago on a similar topic for IACP, and they had scheduled me as the last thing before everybody wanted to go leave for Host Chiefs Night. So I actually had one person during the Q&A session offer me a drink ticket if I would talk faster and finish sooner. So I understand the value of finishing that up. Also, please do ask questions. I am prepared to answer tough questions whenever I come to Philadelphia. I know this because I went to high school around here, and I once saw a crowd of 10,000 Phillies fans boo a 12-year-old Little Leaguer at an exhibition game for not working the count. So I know to expect those kinds of questions and response from the audience. So what is QPP, right? Let's start off with that. Quality of service is something that describes how your data or calls are treated once they are on the network, right? Does it have a certain minimum amount of latency or maximum amount of latency? Is it guaranteed a certain amount of bandwidth? How is it treated once it's on the network, right? Like who gets to go first in terms of the scheduler and just how the data is routed and managed on the network. Priority means that if there is contention for network resources, who gets to get in line first, right? Because your data can't do anything if you didn't have a chance to get up and have the network call on you to send it or receive it. And preemption is the ability to say, okay, we have run out of resources on the network. So we are going to take users who are already on the network and we are going to remove them from the network to make more room for higher priority users who need to have access to the network. QPP is, for the most part, largely about how you deal with contention, right? So that's the idea that not always are you going to have all of the resources available in the network. There are more people trying to get onto the network than it's designed for. In a modern cellular network, it doesn't happen all that often, but it does happen. And so QPP is fundamentally about, all right, if there are more people trying to use this network right now than it was designed for, how is it that you make sure that the people who are important get through? And in the case of FirstNet specifically, that's all about prioritizing public safety. So we're going to talk about how this has been done in the past, how it's been done now, but the fundamental point is how do you design a network where public safety is always going to come first and is going to get the resources that they need. So the capability of managing priority in wireless networks has evolved dramatically over the last few years especially, but even just, over the decades or two that public safety has been around and using wireless networks, right? So when wireless networks, think back to the analog cellular days, they weren't really designed for public safety in mind. They weren't designed for priority. They were still relatively low volume, expensive tools or toys for the wealthy and those who could afford it. So they weren't really designed with a large audience in mind. As those technologies grew up over time, the technologies themselves followed the key app or the killer app that network was used for, right? And in 1G, 2G, even moving on to 3G days, the killer app was voice calls originally and text messages. And the voice call is by nature, or at least traditionally, it's a binary on and off, right? You have the line engaged or you do not. A line is free or it is busy. So when you design the network as a series of voice channels, and ultimately SMS would come to use those same voice channels, but there's not really a whole lot that you can do when it comes to prioritizing users one over the other because somebody's on the phone or they're not on the phone. You can't really do a whole lot with that. And voice prioritization was available. Many of you, so the first commercially available priority service for modern cellular networks that some of you may be familiar with is wireless priority service. Anybody here a wireless priority service user? GETS program, WPS? Okay, so you're familiar with it, and because it was designed around circuit switched voice technology, it fundamentally basically said, well, I can't do anything about this call is more important than that call, but if there are more people trying to make a phone call at any given time than I have room to support, then I will put in priority queuing, where certain people who are registered as WPS members have the ability to go to the front of the line. If everybody's waiting, they'll skip to the front of the line. But it didn't kick anybody off of the network who was already on there. It didn't have the capability to do any kind of real fine-grained prioritization. Now, WPS is evolving in the next year or so. You'll see on most networks, WPS evolve into something that works with voice over LTE, and we'll talk more about that coming up. But it fundamentally, all it could really do was to say that if there were too many people trying to make a phone call at the same time, we'll put these people in the front of the line to get the next available resource when it becomes available. But there wasn't a whole lot more that you could really do with that. But things changed dramatically when LTE was introduced. So for the first time, LTE turned the model of how the network was architected upside down. In the previous 1G, 2G, 3G world, I bit my tongue now, in that world, the network was a series of voice channels. And the way you got data was basically by re-implementing the function of a traditional old 56K modem over that voice channel. That's how you were sending data. And as data speeds increased from 2G to 3G, really all you were doing was taking more of these voice channels and binding them together behind the scenes to act like a modem to send or receive data. But you still had a limitation on that because it was a circuit-switched environment underneath the hood. LTE switches that to become a packet-switched environment, where everything now is data. And voice is just another application, like web browsing or anything else that sits on top of that data network. And when you have a packet-switched network, it revolutionizes your capability to take that and make decisions about how it gets treated, who gets treated, right? Because you now have the ability to look at individual packets, individual users, and say, if I'm sending this kind of data, then I want it to have this priority, and if this guy is sending that kind of data, then it has this priority. You can do a lot of stuff behind the scenes that you simply weren't able to do, that you were able to do now. And in fact, we saw, I think probably late 2013, the first commercially available LTE data priority services, which were sold to public safety and other customers in the United States. Both Verizon and AT&T introduced around that same time commercial LTE prioritization capabilities. In the case of neither of them, though, including AT&T's own commercial offering, were they as sophisticated as what we were able to design for the FirstNet network. So there's a continuing evolution. You'll just see these capabilities improve over time as they go. So what do we talk about when we say, these capabilities that are introduced onto the network with the advent of LTE? You'll hear these acronyms, and I'll talk a bit more about them coming up, but you'll hear things like access class, or AC, or HPA, high priority access. That basically is giving you access into the network at the very fundamental layer if there's contention at the radio. QCI, QoS class indicator or class index. That specifies a whole bunch of things about how your data is handled in terms of the scheduler priority on the network. GBR, guaranteed bit rate, saying that some connections can have a minimum amount of bandwidth which is guaranteed for them to use on the network. ARP value, allocation, retention, and priority. That's when the network is having congestion issues in terms of being able to hand out resources to access the network. So these are all things that are available in the LTE world that were never available before, and how you put them together is the QPP that you create. So when we talk about what FirstNet offers, and what FirstNet offers now is not going to be what FirstNet offers tomorrow and a year from now. We'll talk actually specifically about how it's going to evolve over time. But one of the fundamental things about the way that FirstNet's QPP has been designed. Originally, when FirstNet was created, the primary idea was that, okay, you have this 20 megahertz of spectrum, great beachfront stuff, 700 megahertz. It's being set aside for public safety, And whoever wins the contract to build and operate FirstNet is going to provide priority and preemption on that 20 megahertz of band 14 spectrum. What we at AT&T were able to do in working together with FirstNet was to design a network where those priority and preemption, those QPP benefits, would be provided not just on the band 14, the old D block spectrum, those 20 megahertz, but across all of AT&T's commercial LTE spectrum holdings. So in a lot of cases, that means that you are doubling, tripling, quadrupling, or more in any given market the total amount of spectrum that will have these benefits for public safety. So public safety went from potentially looking at a network with 20 megahertz of spectrum with QPP values on it to make sure it was prioritized first, to, again, depending on the market, a public safety network with up to 100 or more megahertz of spectrum available with those QPP benefits. And we think that radically redefines the public safety experience. It's not just, 20 megahertz by itself is a huge amount of spectrum. And if any of you are radio network managers, you know just how big a number that seems. So 20 megahertz, you take that, and then you add on top of it those same capabilities across the additional depth of commercial spectrum, and that's a lot of capacity for public safety, because we wanted to make sure that in what we were designing, it was something that public safety was not going to have to worry about running out of spectrum with their QPP benefits attached to it. That also has ancillary benefits, one of which, for example, is that it doesn't mean that a public safety agency has to wait until band 14 is deployed in their area in order to adopt FirstNet. I think most of us looked at the situation and expected, okay, well, FirstNet will give an award to somebody, and it'll take 2 or 3 years for them to build out band 14. When that happens, I'll look at FirstNet. But because the LTE spectrum in your area today receives QPP benefits, you don't need to wait for band 14 to be rolled out in your area. You can sign up with FirstNet today and get QPP benefits from that network. You don't have to wait. There's an additional, and I think a lot of people overlook this, but this I think is really important. When we talked about this in the past, again, everybody kind of assumed, well, you have an award, you wait a couple years, band 14 will show up. But it also had the presumption that you were going to have to buy band 14 devices in order to use the FirstNet network and get this QPP capability. Instead, it means that any certified LTE AT&T device today will work with FirstNet and will get those priority and preemption capabilities. So it may be a few years before there's a iPhone whatever that has band 14 in it. But if you really like using the iPhone, it means you can use it on FirstNet today and get that same priority and preemption capabilities. Now, when devices add band 14 in the future, that's great, that's good, because it adds additional spectrum, and that's good spectrum. But it means that you don't have to wait for either a band 14 rollout in your area or for a band 14 to be incorporated into a specific device of your choice before you're able to use it. And that's really powerful, right? Because we know that there's a world of specialty devices that are designed primarily with public safety in mind. You look at a lot of trunk modems, you look at Toughbook laptops, all sorts of stuff, and there's hardened, ruggedized devices from folks like Sonim and Motorola, QoS, and that's a really good ecosystem of devices, and AT&T is very proud to have long-standing relationships with all of those OEMs. But the ability to say, as public safety, I'm not going to have to choose just from this small box. I can choose from this whole box of certified LTE AT&T devices to pick the right tool for the job for my agency. We think that's very powerful, not just because it's more device choice, but also because it includes all these other devices that are produced in the millions of units and are inherently getting much greater economies of scale and lower costs to agencies by letting them use these mass market devices rather than only the ones that are produced in smaller quantities, relatively speaking, and aimed specifically at public safety. You'll see running through all this, a thread of the idea of the right tool for the job, meaning that we want to give public safety as many tools as they can and let them choose how to use that right. So there are, inside the FirstNet classification, we consider there to be primary and extended primary users. Primary users refers to police, fire, EMS, emergency managers, the traditional market of first responders. Extended users are the folks who are either secondary responders or they have some sort of critical infrastructure responsibilities, power company, electric company, sanitation department, water department, transportation, the folks who assist public safety, those folks have the ability to sign up for FirstNet and use it when they, and use it. But the primary first responders are always considered to be highly, that's not even a word, I'm not sure where that came from, but higher prioritized citizens on the network, and we try to maintain that. So the priority and preemption capabilities that the primary public safety users receive are at no additional cost. So they're baked into the service that you receive. You do not pay something additional for your level of priority. We will have on the FirstNet network 3 permanent priority levels that can be assigned. So even within an agency, you can say that these folks, what they're doing is priority 1, what these folks are doing is priority 2, and these folks are doing is priority 3. And for the extended primary users, they'll also have the opportunity to purchase for an additional charge a lower level of priority. But those 3 levels of priority that are permanently assigned to primary users, there's no additional cost for them, and that's baked into everything that they do. We also have created an additional level of priority, which we call incident level. We're still working on some of the names, but the fundamental idea is that this is a temporary highest level of priority on the network. Primary public safety agencies are going to have a local control tool through a website that they're going to be able to access and say, these people are using the FirstNet network in support of an incident right now. No matter what their day-to-day priority level is, because they are responding to the incident, they're the most important people on the network in this area right now, and they should have that top priority. That will work not just within a primary public safety agency's own users, but they will be able to grant this incident level priority to extended primary users, such as, again, the electric company or the water sewer agency, but also to additional primary public safety agencies that are serving in a mutual aid scenario and incident response. So you're going to have this local control command capability to say for both your users, other agencies' primary users, and extended users who needs to have top priority on the network for a temporary period of time, after which, unless they're renewed, they return down to their normal permanent level of priority onto the network. And that the QPP benefits, like I mentioned before, because these are all tied into LTE technology. If you are in an area that's 3G, we're working on getting rid of those by upgrading them all to LTE over the next couple of years. But if you're in a roaming area or you're in a non-LTE area, you won't be able to get these capabilities. It's just the nature of the beast because of these are LTE specific capabilities built into the network. So like I said, QPP is an evolution, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but when we launched officially in June of this year, we launched with priority on all AT&T LTE bands with a variable quality of service capability. We're moving at phase 2, which is targeted for this December, to take all the existing benefits and add on top of that preemption. So starting after phase 2, if there's a situation in the network where there's too many people on and public safety needs to get through, a commercial user can be kicked off the network in order to make room for the public safety user. And then phase 3, which would be the end of March of 2018, that's where we add a whole lot of new capabilities. We'll move from our commercial network core to a dedicated FirstNet private network core. We will have the additional 3 permanent and 1 temporary priority levels that we talked about, and we'll have that local control tool. And that's just the start, right? So just like the FirstNet that you see available today, that in an opt-in state you can go out and purchase and use today, that just gets better over time, and it continues to evolve, both in terms of the services and the applications and everything else, but also in the QPP, because we recognize that QPP is fundamental to FirstNet, right? If there were no such thing as QPP, there wouldn't really be a reason to have a FirstNet, because at its heart, it's making sure that public safety users can get through when they need to, and QPP is fundamental to that, ensuring that capability in times of disaster, emergency, or when there's contention on the network. So all these different acronyms and stuff that I threw out, the QCI, the ARP, the QPP, what does that really mean? So I like to oversimplify how these things work by analogizing each of these capabilities to, let's say you want to get on an airplane and fly somewhere. That's what you're trying to do. And let's analogize that to getting onto the network and getting something done. So your access class, let's say there's contention just getting into the concourse, right? You can't do anything else with the rest of your ticket if you can't get to your gate. There's contention, there's too many people trying to get into the concourse all at the same time. Well, your access class defines your priority at that very first level of getting in, right? So it could say your pre-check, your general boarding line, your premium boarding line, you're in the known crew member line. That access class is going to define just your ability to even get into the concourse to get started. And that's important because a lot of people have asked, well, all these LTE capabilities, if the tower itself is just slammed and I don't have any more radio resources to hand out, what good does this LTE capability do me if I can't even get on the network? And the access class is a key part of making sure that with an elevated access class for public safety, access classes to take a nerd digression here for a minute, they run from 0 through 15, 15 being highest. 0 through 9 are used for all regular commercial customers. Access class 10 is given to E911 callers. And 11 through 15, 12 through 14 of those are specifically reserved for FirstNet users and WPS users to make sure that they have the priority to just get on the network well ahead of everybody else who is a normal commercial user. Your ARP value. So let's say you've gotten into the concourse, you want to get to the gate. Well, here's another choke point, right? Because you have all sorts of people wanting to get onto the plane all at the same time. How do you decide who gets on first? So that's your ARP value, which is like your boarding group, right? That'll determine at another contention point there how it is that you get priority there. And then your QCI or QoS class index represents, in effect, the service and the treatment that you get. You've made it onto the network. You're there now, okay? But what kind of treatment do you get? Do you get to, do you get to get served first? Do you get to have just the peanuts, or are they going to give you a meal? Do you get a window or a middle seat? That's all part of the QCI. And in case there is anyone in the AT&T expense processing department in the audience, I did not book a first-class ticket. I booked a non-refundable economy class fare 28 days in advance and was awarded an upgrade by my frequent flyer program for my many miles of traveling around the country diligently serving AT&T shareholder value in a fiscally appropriate manner. Nobody, come on, I normally get a huge laugh out of that. Thank you. So I will take pity laughs. I will take Jeff, please shut up and move on to the next slide laughs. Really, any kind is okay. So how does this work in reality, right? So let's take an example here. We use the Route 14 analogy. We do treat Band 14 a little different, but this is not, again, specific to Band 14 because it's all of the commercial bands that you're getting priority and preemption on. One thing that's important to note is that if you take this, we say normal operations. One of the questions that we get a lot when we talk to people about QPP is, and this goes back even prior to FirstNet when AT&T introduced our commercial priority product called AT&T Dynamic Traffic Management. I would go out and talk to customers because as a product manager who worked on it, I would come in to have discussions with folks if they had technical questions. And they would say, okay, so when I get this ADTM, this priority program onto my lines of service, what do I see? And I'd say, nothing. Because the whole point is that if the network is going just fine, then there's not a difference to notice. If you have no congestion on the highway, you as public safety will be in the fast lane, you'll be in the HOV lane or the hot lane, whatever. But if there's no contention for traffic, if it's 2 a.m. on a Thursday, everybody's going to be driving the same speed. So you only really notice these benefits when there is contention on the network. So it's tough in some cases to make that feel, to show the visceral examples of it. And we can provide folks with information on, when we look at the network after an emergency happens and how people get through. But it's not something that you immediately feel like, oh, I joined FirstNet and suddenly my download speeds were twice as fast. Where the value comes in is that when something happened, everybody else was getting choked out of the network, and you never even noticed that there was congestion on the network because QPP made sure that you had the top priority to get those resources in the network, so you didn't even know that there was congestion there. So under normal situations, you've got our primary users in the fast lane. You've got extended primary users also on the network, and there's also commercial users. They're talking to a different network core. They're talking to the commercial core, but they may be on band 14 or any of these other spectrum bands that we've got. But then you've got a situation where there's a crisis and there's more public safety users starting to move onto the network. And what happens then is that the primary users are taking advantage of their top level of priority. The extended primary users are still there, but you start to see commercial traffic directed away from the network, right? So as they're running out of resources using this preemption capability, you've moved off the commercial users. And so now you've got the primary users taking up more of the network because they've got priority over the extended primary users. And eventually, conceivably, the extended primary users eventually may be moved off the network entirely as well. So that ultimately you have all of this spectrum available to primary public safety agencies, so that you've got this capability where all of the spectrum, not just band 14, and band 14, again, we do treat that a little differently. When we have our primary, our private network core for FirstNet beginning early next year, we'll have it set up such that if band 14 is deployed in an area, public safety users with FirstNet SIM cards will be directed to go to band 14 first. Commercial users with AT&T SIM cards, if there's band 14 in an area, will be directed to go there last, only as a band of last resort, if other bands are used up. So that you'll have band 14 as a primary home for public safety, but the ability to use all those other bands. But generally speaking, across this entire spectrum depth, you'll have public safety taking priority, not just inside of 20 megahertz, but inside of the entire spectrum value that AT&T has available within that market. This is a way to kind of illustrate a little bit. We talked about the permanent and the temporary levels of priority. The AT&T commercial core is what's operating today up until that phase 3 at end of March 2018, when we move our FirstNet users to the FirstNet dedicated core. The commercial core we have up and running now. It has one level of priority for primary users. It has an optional level of priority for extended primary users. Then that sits basically, there's one level above what regular users get. When we have the FirstNet dedicated core above the best effort level that's for general consumers, you'll have 3 priority levels that are permanent, like I said, and a highest level incident level for users who are responding to an incident. And it doesn't really show this right in the slide. But if you were to stack them up in terms of direct numeric values, in terms of their QPP levels, what you would see is that FirstNet priority level on the commercial core is right around that FirstNet priority 3 level on the dedicated core. So when we move to this dedicated core early next year, not only are you getting more priority levels, you are getting even better priority levels. And like I said before, this is all part of an evolution, right? We knew that it was important when we won the FirstNet award, and we heard it from the folks at the FirstNet Authority as our partners in this, and the folks who have oversight over us. It's important to emphasize that FirstNet is not just a brand name or a name of a service that AT&T provides. FirstNet is an independent government agency that's an authority that has responsibility for representing public safety and having oversight over AT&T to make sure that we as industry are not building industry's idea of what a public safety network should be, but public safety's idea of what a public safety network should be. And that's a unique position that they have, to be looking over our shoulders to make sure that we are building the kind of network that public safety wants and needs. We knew that it was important to be able to come out of the gate with something quickly. So we worked out with FirstNet an approach to say, let's take the existing AT&T network core, all of our existing AT&T devices, let's do priority there, let's add preemption as soon as we can, but let's offer this now so that people don't have to wait to adopt FirstNet. People don't have to wait to get QPP over the same kind of network coverage that they're used to getting today. And let's just build on top of that. We have, when we come out in 2018, this dedicated network core, additional levels, all sorts of other great stuff. Additionally, the way that we are designing this in the 2018 approach with the dedicated network core is instead of saying public safety, we need you to pick out the applications that are important to you, or say, you public safety, you can only have 2 megabits per second worth of bandwidth that will be prioritized and everything else will be treated as best effort. We are instead saying, public safety, we believe that what you are doing is important no matter what it is. So we are applying this priority, preemption, all these things to all of a public safety, a FirstNet primary users traffic. We're saying that we're not going to try to make you pick out in advance what applications are important. We're not going to have to make you maintain a list of, oh, well, this is my CAD IP address and this, that, and the other thing. We're going to say, no, we think that all of what you do is important so that public safety does not have to jump through hoops and doesn't have to know in advance what are the things that it needs to have prioritized on the network, especially in the case of an emergency. Now, over time, one of the fundamental contradictions of QPP is, as they say, the more special people you have, the less special those people are. So as usage of the network grows over time, what we want to do is to work with public safety, to work with FirstNet, with PSCR, with PSAC, with all these folks representing public safety to find what's a good way for us to implement smarter controls over the network where we say maybe, yeah, you know what, there would be, blacklist, whitelist, graylist, whatever the public safety can opt into and say, yeah, you know what, we're pretty sure Netflix is not going to be important on our network. You don't have to do priority to that. Or create some dynamic tools. But the point is that over time, we want to develop tools that make it easy and straightforward for public safety to get the stuff prioritized that it needs. But until we think we have what is an optimal solution for that, we're taking the approach of saying, public safety, you're not going to have to jump through hoops in order to determine what's a priority. We believe that everything you do is a priority. So, key takeaways, and I bet everybody was waiting for this slide because it means I'm almost over. Priority and preemption on all bands, right? So not just band 14, not just 20 megahertz, but in most places, several multiples of that. Multiple priority levels so that agencies can say, let's have some granular priority in terms of what this person's role is, what this video camera's role is compared with this trunk modem or this MDT or this smartphone that an officer is using or that management is using, right? The ability to grant an incident level of priority, which is temporary, but primary agencies will have control over that for their own users, for other users in other primary agencies or extended users. And this is an area actually where we're really looking forward to a lot of discussion with public safety because we understand that there's probably not a mutual aid agreement or a TIC plan anywhere in the country that deals with how do I manage your data and how do you manage mine. This is one of the areas where we think that idea of the right tool for the job came in very important because instead of us dictating how that should all work, we wanted to say, here are the tools, this is what we're going to make available, and we want to work with public safety to help you figure out how that works into your workflow, right? What is the right way? Do you want to have this coordinated on a regional basis? Do you want to have individual plans within agencies to do this? Do you want to have it centralized on a state basis? We look to the localities. We're going to make the tools available for managing these things, and we want to let public safety take the administrative and the policy control over how to manage these things within their localities and within their regions and their states and tribal areas. For primary users, again, first responder, public safety, there's no additional charge for any of this QPP capability. And this, I think, is one of the more important ones, especially for anyone who's had managing duties on a radio network in the past. We wanted to make sure that this was baked into the brains of the network. Instead of having public safety agencies have to do the same kind of hands-on management of the LTE network that they've had to do for ages with radio networks, right? This isn't a narrowband environment. This isn't a place where you're going to have to turn down channels or squelch people or do whatever else to preserve valuable capacity on the radio network. This is an opportunity to say we've got all this capacity and we've got the brains baked into the network. So you, as public safety, you tell us who is important and in what order, and the network will do all the work for you to make sure that folks can get through and in that priority level that you've described. So that, thankfully, is the end of my presentation. Do we have any questions which are not from the hecklers or the AT&T people that showed up and brought air horns to try to throw me off my game? Yes, sir, please.
You mentioned guaranteed bit rate, and you mentioned 2 megabits. Is that going to be your guaranteed bit rate?
Okay, good question. So that was purely an example. Guaranteed bit rate levels are generally only for specific applications inside that live inside the network, like voice over LTE services. Over time, as the capabilities of the standards-based QPP grows and expands, we may add more GBR services like and this is actually a great question brings up. So we have, outside of what you saw in here, AT&T and FirstNet together have a committed contractual roadmap that over the first 5 years of FirstNet will include things like mission-critical push-to-talk, enhanced public safety grade voice and data, mission-critical video, mission-critical data, Z-axis location, all sorts of other stuff. But as some of these new services like mission-critical PTT come out, those may well get assigned guaranteed bit rates for specific applications. They're not today. Really only VoLTE and a few other things would get guaranteed bit rates, but we're working on expanding those again because there's parts of the LTE QoS capabilities that haven't even been implemented by manufacturers yet. They're part of future 3GPP standards releases and stuff like that. So there's a lot more to come in terms of additional capabilities. The 2 megabit per second was that I threw out was that there was somebody else who has provided in the past a priority service, and 2 megabit per second was what they were saying was here's the amount of priority traffic that you can get. That was more just by way of illustration, and I'm saying that in this, whatever your connection is can all be prioritized. You're not restricted to a certain predetermined amount of priority traffic. Yes, sir.
Regardless of what the guarantee happens to be, where does that guarantee get reflected? Does that get reflected in the user agreement between AT&T and the city of whatever, or somewhere else?
Good question. So when you say guarantee, are you talking about specifically in the word of guaranteed bit rate, or?
A fee on the above. Anything that you are guaranteeing to a particular user, where does that get reflected?
Okay, so that's a good question. So the G of the guaranteed and guaranteed bit rate is a technical term of art. It doesn't reflect like something that you see in your contract. Whatever the terms are of performance and service would be in the contract between AT&T, FirstNet, and the Public Safety User Agency. So they would be able to look there and see whatever is being.
I can't see the contract between AT&T and FirstNet.
Sorry, yeah. Let me rephrase. The contract between AT&T / FirstNet and the Public Safety Agency is where any specific terms and deliverables would be. The contract between AT&T and FirstNet is not generally visible. It's filled with a lot of extremely proprietary and sensitive information. Sorry? The way that FirstNet structured its RFP process, it understood from feedback from multiple carriers and other industry sources that a fully available contract with all of the technical details to it would be something that would discourage competition and would discourage participation because of how sensitive some of the technical information is in it. Okay. Yeah, very good question. So that is a very good question, and it brings up what I think is a very important point, which is that FirstNet is not a mandate. We recognize very clearly that FirstNet for public safety is an option, that nobody is going to be forced to use FirstNet because a lot of public safety agencies, they have the other commercial carriers available as options, and we recognize that if we're not offering a superior product, we don't have any expectation that public safety is going to use FirstNet. We know that we have to win public safety's business. Every single agency, every single opportunity, every single time by providing the best product, the best priority, the best network coverage, the best pricing for public safety. They will have the choice between us and everybody else, and we're not taking any of this for granted. If we don't provide the best service, then we fully expect public safety will say no thank you and choose someone else. Yes, sir.
In the interest of unified communication, don't we have a task force or department that needs to get on comms with somebody else in another jurisdiction? One has FirstNet, the other one doesn't. Is there going to be any issue with that communication?
Great question. So our approach with FirstNet is not to create a walled garden of sorts. There will be certain things, if you, for example, have an ES chat server, and it's plugged into an interoperability console somewhere to be able to communicate with a two-way radio network, your ES chat users are going to be able to use FirstNet, and they're going to be able to use Verizon or T-Mobile or Sprint or anybody else. So if you are using a PTT service that is baked into FirstNet, like a mission-critical service, we'll have to see how those future things come out in terms of interoperability. But generally speaking, if you're using an over-the-top communications like a PTT system or a CAD system or anything else, there's no walled garden saying only on FirstNet are you going to be able to use your NetMotion or your CAD or your whatever else. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
SIM that just identifies the DNA of the device, and can you explain how the device gets to the uplink?
Device gets to the what, sorry?
To the, fast lane, the hub.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, good question. Okay. So on today's network, where all the FirstNet sort of early adopter users are on the AT&T commercial core, they have a regular AT&T SIM card in them, but there's a code assigned to their account. So on any carrier, you have an account, which is your phone number, and then there's, in the provisioning system of the network, there's all sorts of different codes that are attached to it, which says things like, is this line of service allowed to tether a laptop to it? How many minutes do they get? Are they allowed to roam internationally? Well, there's another one of those codes which says this person has a higher QCI, ARP value, and high priority access, so that the network knows to provide those things. In the future, when we move to a separate network core, so starting early next year, the dedicated FirstNet core will be up. If we had more time, we would have done that straight with the dedicated core from the beginning, but we knew we wanted to get to market quickly and give people the opportunity to test out FirstNet. So when we move to that separate network core, we'll actually have FirstNet SIM cards that say FirstNet on them. And to get all the FirstNet benefits and connect to that core, you'll need a FirstNet SIM card. And that will have the same kind of codes put onto it in order to provide the higher access. But touching the FirstNet core, there's more levels for it to use and the local control tool and all sorts of other stuff that where you're starting to see, and I think this will continue over time, features that get built into the FirstNet core that aren't built into the commercial core because they're just for public safety and commercial users aren't ever going to need them. So there is a special FirstNet SIM card coming that will open up the door to all of those capabilities on the FirstNet dedicated core. Yes. I'm not aware, really. I think probably I'll just say that interoperability means a lot of things to a lot of people, and without knowing a lot more details, it's very, very difficult to make any kind of statement about that. So I think there's folks both at the FirstNet booth and as well as our AT&T folks here who could probably give you a better answer about that. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you all very, 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 very much for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.